It was a Saturday in October, the kind where the Colorado sky sits low and flat, the color of old pewter, and the air carries that first warning bite of winter. Jake Coleman had been awake since 5. Not because Sophie needed him. She was still asleep when he got up, her face half buried in the blueberry-colored throw pillow she dragged from her bedroom to the couch 3 months ago and never dragged back. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at her. 8 years old. Eyelashes still, that specific stillness kids have when they're dreaming. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table with the folded piece of paper he'd been looking at for 6 weeks. It wasn't a fancy document, just a printout from his bank's online portal. The savings account he'd opened 2 years ago, 6 weeks after the funeral, when he was sitting in this same chair at this same table at 5 in the morning and decided he needed something to work toward or he was going to fall apart completely. The balance on the paper read $47,200. He'd started with $11. He drank his coffee and looked at the number for a long time. Then he went and woke Sophie up. She was in the passenger seat of the old pickup when they pulled into the lot of Mercer Luxury Auto Group on East Colfax at 10:14 a.m. The truck was a 2009 Ford F-150, dark blue with a crack in the windshield that started at the bottom left corner and had been slowly, patiently migrating toward the center for the past 18 months. The rear bumper had a dent the size of a basketball. The side panels were laced with small rust blooms at the door seams. Not catastrophic yet, just honest. Jake had bought it 8 years ago, 2 months before the wedding. Claire had complained about it exactly once, then never again, because she understood, the way she always understood things without needing them explained, that the truck was not really about transportation. Now Sophie sat in it with her knees pulled up to her chest and her sneakers on the dashboard, which Jake had given up fighting. She was wearing her yellow raincoat even though it wasn't raining. She wore it most days. She said it was lucky. "That place looks like a spaceship," she said. Jake looked at the showroom, glass and polished chrome. A row of vehicles visible through the window, gleaming, enormous, pristine. A sign above the entrance in brushed steel letters. Mercer Luxury Auto Group. Denver flagship. "Yeah," he said. "Are we going in?" "That's the plan." Sophie looked at her father. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt, dark navy, the one she'd given him for Christmas last year. His hands were on the steering wheel still, even though they were parked. There was a faint line of grease along his left thumbnail that he hadn't entirely gotten out. He never entirely got it out. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "You look nervous." He looked at her. She was watching him with that steady, patient expression she'd had since she was 3, the expression that made people say she had an old soul, which was a thing adults said when they didn't know how else to describe a child who paid close attention. "I'm not nervous," he said. "I'm just thinking." "About what?" He was quiet for a moment. "About how much your mom would have liked this," he said. Sophie pulled her knees tighter to her chest. She looked at the showroom again. Then she said, "She would have picked the blueberry one." "The blueberry one?" "The dark blue one in the window. She always said blueberry was the best blue." Jake looked at the SUV in the showroom window. It was a deep, rich, midnight blue. Not quite navy, not quite purple. He hadn't noticed it until Sophie pointed it out. His jaw moved once, tightly. "Yeah," he said. She would have. They got out of the truck. The doors slid open automatically, and the air inside was a different temperature. Cooler, cleaner, with the faint chemical scent of something recently polished. The floor was white marble, or something that looked exactly like white marble. The lighting came from thin strips in the ceiling, indirect and even, the kind that made everything look like it was lit for a photograph. There were 6 vehicles on the floor. Each one sat on a circular platform of dark hardwood, slightly raised, the way sculptures sit in museums. Sophie stopped walking. She turned in a slow circle, looking at everything. The cars, the ceiling, the light fixtures, the espresso bar in the far corner, unmanned but gleaming, the small potted olive trees in white concrete planters. "Dad," she breathed. "I know," Jake said. He'd done his homework. 3 months of research, safety ratings, reliability reports, resale values, insurance estimates. He had a notebook in his jacket pocket with specs written in his careful engineer's handwriting. 2 columns, pros and cons, 6 models across 4 pages. He'd narrowed it down to 2. Both were in his budget. One of them was almost certainly the blueberry one. A salesman appeared. His name tag said Tyler. He was in his late 20s, in a suit that fit well, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested he'd spent time on it that morning. He looked at Jake. He looked at Jake's truck through the glass. He looked back at Jake. The look lasted less than 2 seconds. It was not a long look. But Jake had grown up in a house where the heat sometimes didn't work in January, and where his father came home from the shop in clothes that smelled like brake fluid. And he knew that look the way some people know their own heartbeat, without thinking about it, without having to name it. He said nothing. "Good morning," Tyler said. "Can I help you with something?" There was a pause inside that question, a tiny, almost invisible pause. But it was there. "Looking at SUVs," Jake said. "Specifically the Meridian 450, or the XE Touring. I've done some research. I'd like to talk numbers today if possible." Tyler's expression shifted in a way that was technically neutral. His eyes moved briefly to Sophie, who was now standing very close to the blueberry SUV on its platform, her face about 4 inches from the rear panel, examining the paint. "Sure," Tyler said. "Of course. You know, those are both. They're really in the luxury tier. Starting price on the Meridian is around $68,000 before options. The XE Touring base is closer to $71. "I know," Jake said. "I've been following the pricing for about 3 months. Right. Tyler nodded slowly. He was not looking at his notebook. He was looking at Jake's hands, at the cracked thumbnail. "We also have some, and this isn't anything against you, we also carry a used, pre-certified inventory at a facility about 6 blocks east of here. Those are excellent vehicles. Very competitive." Jake looked at him. Something shifted in the room. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the almost imperceptible change in temperature that happens in a space when 2 people suddenly understand each other completely. Jake said, "I'm familiar with pre-certified inventory. I'm not looking for pre-certified inventory. I'm looking at those 2. He gestured, with one careful finger, at the 2 vehicles across the floor. Sophie had turned around. She was watching. The manager arrived 4 minutes later. His name, according to his tag and the general low-frequency deference everyone in the room aimed in his direction, was Brad Hollis. He was 50, thick through the shoulders, with silver temples and a face like a closed door. He came and stood slightly behind Tyler in a way that was technically backing up his employee, but was functionally saying, "I agree." "Hey there," Brad said, and his voice was friendly the way a wall is friendly. Smooth, flat, hard. "Tyler been taking good care of you?" "We were just getting started," Jake said. Great. Look, and I want to be straightforward with you because I think that's respectful. These are significant investments. The Meridian, the XE. Most of our clients here, they come in with, it's not unusual for financing to be the starting point. Is that the direction you were thinking?" "No," Jake said. "I was thinking cash." A very brief silence. Brad looked at Tyler. Tyler looked at the floor. "That's great," Brad said, and now the friendliness had a new quality. Performative, a little too precise. "That's great, absolutely. Still, you know what might actually serve you better? Our other location, on Yosemite. They've got a fantastic selection. Range of vehicles for a range of, situations. I can even call ahead. Let them know you're coming." Sophie made a small sound. It wasn't a word. It wasn't even really a sound. It was the almost inaudible exhale of a child who has understood something and wishes they hadn't. Jake turned and looked at her. She was standing very still next to the blueberry SUV. Her chin was down. Her eyes were on the floor, that white marble floor, and her hands were shoved deep in the pockets of her yellow raincoat. Jake looked at his daughter for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked back at Brad Hollis and said in a voice that was completely even, completely calm, stripped entirely of anything that could be called emotion, "Thank you for your time." He walked to Sophie. He put his hand on her shoulder. She leaned into him, slightly, the way kids do when they're tired or sad and don't want to make a thing of it. They walked out. The automatic doors opened. The October air came in. They crossed the parking lot in silence. At 10:41 a.m., a black Genesis G90 pulled into the lot. It parked 2 spaces down from Jake's old pickup. Diana Mercer stepped out. She was 42 years old, 5'7", in a dark gray blazer and trousers she'd been wearing since an early meeting with the insurance consultants at 7. She had her phone in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, cold by now, and she was scanning the front of the showroom the way she scanned everything, quickly, systematically, already building a list. This was a surprise visit. She did them at every location, every quarter, without notice. Her operations director called them the fog because they rolled in without warning and left things rearranged. She was 3 steps into the parking lot when she saw the truck. She stopped. Not all the way. More like a stutter in her stride, one foot that nearly didn't land. She looked at the truck. Dark blue, cracked windshield, rust at the door seams, the rear bumper with its basketball dent. For a moment, she was not in a parking lot in Denver in October. She was on Highway 9, outside of Ridgeway, the road covered in 2 inches of black ice, the temperature at -11, and the front of her car was wrapped around a guardrail and the engine was burning. 10 years ago. She had been 32. She had been driving back from a meeting in Telluride and she had taken the highway instead of the mountain route because she'd been running late, and a transport truck had clipped her on a curve, and the world had gone sideways in a way it was never quite supposed to go sideways. She remembered the sound of the window breaking. She remembered that she could not feel her left hand. She remembered the cold coming in from somewhere. The door had crumpled into the frame and wasn't a door anymore, just a bent piece of metal. And she remembered smelling the smoke before she saw the fire, which was worse. She could not get out. The door, her seatbelt, locked, her left hand, wrong. And then there had been hands. Not asking, not saying anything, just hands at the window, breaking the glass the rest of the way out. She heard that sound, a specific sound, nothing else like it. And then the seatbelt was cut and she was being pulled, and the cold was the whole world for about 4 seconds. And then she was on the shoulder of the road in the snow, and someone was crouching next to her, and someone else, a woman's voice somewhere, was calling 911. She had looked at him, the one crouching. He was maybe 30, maybe younger. Work jacket, red and black, zipper broken at the top, grease on his hands. He'd used his jacket to break the window, she realized. The sleeve was torn through. "You're okay," he said. "Stay here, you're okay." She had tried to ask his name. She was not sure if she'd said the words or only thought them. The fire behind him was louder now, and there were other people stopping, and someone was wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and when she looked back to where the man had been crouching, he was gone. She had asked about him later at the hospital. No one knew. She'd hired a private investigator to look the following year. He'd found nothing conclusive. She had thought about the broken zip jacket for 10 years. Diana walked into the showroom at a pace that her staff recognized. Long strides, chin up, phone down. Someone was going to learn something today. She did not announce herself at the front. She never did. She walked the floor, she read the room, and then she found the manager. She found Tyler first. She watched him for a moment, the way he was standing, slightly loose, unwound, the way people stand after attention has left the room. She noted it. "Morning," she said. "Ms. Mercer, I didn't know you were—" "I know," she said. "Where's Brad?" She found the video 11 minutes later. A couple of clients had been near the entrance when Jake and Sophie walked out. One of them had been filming something on his phone, his kid apparently looking at a display car, and the camera had been rolling when Jake and Brad Hollis had their exchange. 56 seconds. Diana watched it 3 times in Brad's office, on his desk monitor, with Brad standing against the wall behind her, and Tyler in the doorway, and nobody saying anything. She watched Sophie's face when Brad said the thing about a range of vehicles for a range of situations. She watched the way the little girl's chin came down. She watched Jake Coleman put his hand on his daughter's shoulder. She sat for a moment after the video ended. The office was very quiet. "Close the showroom floor," she said. "Ms. Mercer, for today, close the floor." She stood. "Brad, I need you in the conference room in 20 minutes with your performance file and any records from this morning's client logs." She looked at Tyler. "Same for you. Bring whoever else was on the floor." She walked out of the office and into the showroom, which was emptying now, and she stood for a moment next to the Blueberry SUV, the Meridian 450 Midnight Blue. And she looked at its color, and she thought about a little girl in a yellow raincoat with her chin down and her hands in her pockets. And she thought, find him. Diana Mercer's assistant, Priya, was 26 years old and had once found a retired senator's phone on a commercial flight and returned it before the plane landed. She was very good at finding things. It took her 40 minutes. Jake Coleman, age 38. Address, 1714 Larimer Street, Denver, Colorado. Former employee of Garrett Engineering Associates, where he had worked for 6 years as a senior mechanical engineer before resigning in March 4 years ago. Bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Colorado State University, class of 2009. Graduated with a 3.97 GPA. Thesis advisor, Professor Randall Chen. Thesis title, Thermal Stress Modeling in High Cycle Fatigue Environments. Currently employed as a mechanic at Brennan's Auto Service, South Broadway. She attached the file to an email to Diana, and then because she was thorough, she added one more document she'd found, a death notice from the Denver Post, dated 4 years and 2 months ago. Claire Ann Coleman, née Whitfield, age 34. Beloved wife of Jacob Coleman, devoted mother of Sophie. Passed peacefully after a 14-month illness. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the University of Colorado Cancer Center. Diana read the file in her car. She read the death notice twice. She sat in her car for 4 minutes. Just sat. Then she put the car in drive. They were at a diner on South Pearl Street when Diana walked in. Jake was looking at the menu. Sophie was coloring in a paper placemat with 3 crayons she'd pulled from her coat pocket. She always had 3 crayons in her coat pocket, in case of exactly this kind of situation. And she was narrating quietly to herself, the way she did when she thought no one was listening. "Blue for the house," she was saying. "Yellow for the sky. Green for the... Actually, maybe green for the grass, and I need a purple for the sky. But I don't have purple, so I'll use blue. Blue for everything." Jake was watching her over the menu and not reading the menu. When the bell above the diner door chimed and he looked up, he saw a woman in a gray blazer scanning the room. She found him in about 2 seconds. She walked over. He didn't recognize her. "Mr. Coleman?" she said. "Yeah." "My name is Diana Mercer. I own Mercer Automotive Holdings." She paused. "May I sit down?" A long moment. Sophie had stopped coloring. She was looking at the woman with the same steady, attentive expression she'd aimed at the showroom earlier. Jake looked at Diana, then at the door, then at Diana again. "Sure," he said. She told him what she'd seen. Not all of it, not yet. Just the video, what Brad and Tyler had done, that she'd closed the floor and was conducting a full review of the staff's conduct. She told him that the behavior he and his daughter had experienced was in direct violation of everything the company was supposed to stand for, and that she wanted to personally apologize. She did not say, "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." She said, "What happened to your daughter in there? That's not something she should have experienced. I'm sorry." Jake had his coffee cup in both hands. He was looking at the table. His jaw was set. Sophie was still coloring, or pretending to color. The crayon had stopped moving. "Okay," Jake said. "That's all?" Diana said. He looked up. "I don't know what else you want me to say." "It's not the first time." He said it simply, without anger, the way a person says something that has stopped requiring a reaction. "It's fine." "It's not fine." "No," he said, "it's not. But it happens. I parked an old truck and walked in wearing a flannel shirt, and they made a decision based on that, and it's not fine, but it's not new." Sophie looked up from her placemat. She looked at Jake. Then she looked at Diana. "He saved up for 2 years," Sophie said. Jake looked at her. "He works on Saturdays," she said. "And he does extra jobs. Mr. Brennan gives him extra jobs sometimes. He's been saving since—" She trailed off. Her voice had gone slightly smaller. "Since after Mom." Diana was quiet. "Sophie," Jake said softly. "I'm just saying," she said and went back to her coloring. But her hand was shaking a little. Diana did not bring up the accident on Highway 9 right then. She almost did. The words were there, organized and ready, but she looked at the man across the table, the stiff-held jaw, the grease under the thumbnail, the way he kept half his attention on his daughter at all times, that quiet, permanent vigilance of someone who has decided that, whatever he's lost, this small person will not also be lost. And she understood that the accident was a separate conversation. What she said was, "I'd like to invite you back to the showroom, to choose the vehicle you came in for." Jake shook his head. "I'd like to offer—" "I don't want it offered," he said. Not hard, not cold, just clear. "I've got the money. I saved it. I want to pay for it the same as anyone else." She looked at him. "Then come back and pay for it." He was quiet. "Full price," she said. "Whatever vehicle you want. No discounts you didn't ask for, no special treatment. Just come back." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. He looked at Sophie. "Dad," Sophie said without looking up from her coloring. "I didn't say anything," Jake said. "You were about to say no." "I wasn't." She looked up at him with one eyebrow slightly raised, a gesture so precisely like her mother's that Jake had to look away for a moment. "Fine," he said. "Okay." They went back that afternoon. The showroom was quiet. Staff had been sent to a mandatory review session in the back conference rooms. Only 2 senior associates, both women, both who had worked for the company for over 8 years, remained to help clients. The floor was clean and still. Sophie walked straight to the Blueberry Meridian. She put both hands flat on the side panel and looked at her reflection in the paint. Jake walked the floor slowly, notebook still in his jacket pocket, hands loose at his sides. He looked at the vehicle the way he looked at an engine, methodically, starting with what he could see, building toward what he couldn't. He checked the door seals. He opened the hood. One of the senior associates handed him a spec sheet he didn't need because he already knew the specs, but he took it anyway. Diana stood near the entrance and watched. She had been in this industry for 16 years. She had sat through hundreds of sales floor transactions, had run the analytics on thousands more. She had a calibrated eye for the moment when someone decides to buy something. That specific shift in body language, the slightly loosened shoulders, the hand that stops flipping the spec sheet and just rests. She watched Jake's hand stop flipping the spec sheet and just rest. He bought the Meridian 450 in midnight blue. He paid in full, cash transfer, completed before 3 o'clock. He shook hands with the associate who processed the paperwork. He was polite and specific and unhurried. Sophie asked if she could sit in the driver's seat while they waited for the paperwork. "You're 8, Jake said. "I'm almost 9, she said. "I should get familiar with the controls." "For 3 years from now, when you can legally sit in the front seat?" "For 9 years from now when I drive." He looked at Diana. Diana tried not to smile. She mostly didn't succeed. "Yeah," Jake said. "Okay, sit in the driver's seat." They were in the parking lot, Jake doing a final walk round of the Meridian, Sophie already buckled into the passenger seat of the new car, reorganizing her crayons in the cup holder, when Diana said it. "Jake." He looked up. "There was an accident," she said. "Highway 9. Outside Ridgeway. About 10 years ago. January. A woman's car went off the road and hit a guardrail and caught fire." He went very still. "She couldn't get out," Diana said. "Someone stopped, broke the window, pulled her out." She paused. Red and black work jacket, zipper broken at the top. A long silence. Jake was looking at the ground. His hands were in his jacket pockets. "I've been trying to find that person," Diana said, "for 10 years. He said nothing. "I hired an investigator. He got close, but—" She stopped. "It was you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You weren't supposed to be in a car alone in that weather." "No," she said. "I wasn't. I saw the car. Anyone would have stopped." "They didn't," she said, very quietly. "They drove past. I counted. 3 cars drove past." His jaw was tight. "You left," she said. "Before the ambulance. Before anyone got your name." "I had somewhere to be," he said. And then, after a pause, "Claire was having a test that afternoon at University Hospital. I didn't want to be late." Claire. The name sat in the air between them. Diana didn't say anything. She just let it sit. "She was fine that day," he said. "The test came back fine. That time." He said the last 2 words like they were something he'd learned to carry. Not heavily. He'd been carrying them long enough. Just deliberately. "I'm glad you were there," Diana said. He nodded once. He looked at the new car, at Sophie's silhouette in the passenger seat, head bent over her crayons, reorganizing them in some system only she understood. "She's great," Diana said. "Yeah," Jake said. "She is." 2 days later, Diana called. He was under a 17 Subaru at the time, replacing a rear differential seal that someone had been ignoring for approximately a year and a half. His phone was on the floor beside the creeper, and he had to roll out to answer it, and there was a smear of gear oil on his left forearm. "I looked at your file," Diana said. "Your professional file? Colorado State, Professor Chen's program. Garrett Engineering. You were a senior engineer." "Yeah," he said. "You left when your wife got sick." "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have a position. Head of Technical Operations for Mercer Holdings. It's not automotive. It's a mechanical engineering role, overseeing maintenance systems and technical infrastructure across all 15 of our properties. You'd be building a department, essentially from scratch." She paused. "Salary range is 120 to 140, depending on structure. There's full flexibility on schedule. We can build in whatever you need for Sophie's school, pickups, medical appointments, whatever it looks like. And there's a remote component. I'd say 40% of it is things you could do from home." He was sitting on the garage floor with his back against the Subaru. He was not saying anything. "You don't have to decide now," she said. "I haven't done engineering work in 4 years, he said. "I know. I've been under cars." I know what you've been doing, she said. I also know what you built at Garrett. I spoke to your former director, Ron Alvarez. He said, and I'm quoting him, that losing you was the best decision the company never had a choice about. Jake was quiet. That means he regretted it, Diana said helpfully. I understood what it meant, he said, and something in his voice had shifted, a small sound, not quite a laugh, but the place in the throat where a laugh lives before it decides whether to happen. Think about it, she said. Take the week. He looked at the garage ceiling. The fluorescent light above him had a flicker, the same slow pulse it had had since he started here, that he'd been meaning to fix for 3 months. Okay, he said. He didn't tell Sophie about it that night. He thought about how to start the conversation, whether to wait until the weekend, whether to talk to Brennan first, whether any of this was real, or whether he was somehow misunderstanding something. He made dinner. Pasta carbonara, Sophie's specific request. He let her tell him about something that had happened at school, a thing with a boy named Cody who had apparently said that blueberry was not a real blue, and Sophie had explained at significant length why he was wrong. What did Cody say? Jake asked. He said blueberry is a shade of purple, which is scientifically incorrect and also just rude. He was wrong, Jake said. I told him it's in the cool blue family, just with red wavelength undertones, which is a feature, not a flaw. She paused. He didn't know what wavelength undertones were. Did that upset him? A little, but he'll be fine. He needs to read more. Jake laughed. A real one. It surprised him slightly, the way real laughs sometimes do. He looked at her across the table. The carbonara, the yellow raincoat hung on her chair because she always hung it on her chair. The crayons arranged in a row beside her plate, and he thought, what would Claire say? He knew what Claire would say. Claire had been a high school art teacher. She had believed very specifically that the right job was not the one that paid the most. It was the one that made you someone your kid could model themselves on. She had said this to him once when he was considering a lucrative offer from a contractor that would have meant more travel. She had said it plainly, the way she said everything, without judgment and without drama. I want Sophie to grow up watching you do work that matters to you. He hadn't taken the contractor job, but he'd also stopped doing work that mattered, somewhere in the fog of those 14 months and the 2 years that came after. He was looking at Sophie, and Sophie was looking back at him. Dad, she said. Yeah. You've got your thinking face. I have a thinking face. It looks like your normal face, but slightly more still. He looked down at his plate, then back up. There might be a new job, he said. He told her, briefly. The version she could hold, engineering, a bigger company, different hours, more money, he could be home more. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Are you scared? She asked. A little, he said. Yeah. She nodded slowly. She looked at her pasta. Then she looked up. Mom always said you were the smartest person she'd ever met, she said. She said you just didn't act like it because you were also the least showy person she'd ever met. She picked up her fork. She would have wanted you to do it. Jake looked at his daughter. His throat was tight. He pressed his lips together, once. She'd want you to be happy again, Sophie said. She'd probably want to argue about some of the details, because she always argued about details, but mostly, she'd want you to be happy. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said everything, not performing comfort, just stating something she considered obvious. Jake put his fork down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Yeah, he said. She would. Sophie was already eating. She glanced up. Also, she said, the new job pays better, which means you can fix the truck's bumper, which has been embarrassing me at school pickup for approximately 1 year. Jake looked at her. I'm just saying, she said. The bumper is fine. It looks like someone sat on it. Someone did sit on it. That's how it got dented. Who sat on our... She stopped. Dad? It was your Uncle Marcus, at the 4th of July. He bets me it would hold his weight. And he was wrong. Sophie considered this. Okay, she said, still embarrassing. He called Diana the following Thursday. I'll take it, he said. Good, she said. No fanfare, no excessive enthusiasm, just the word, clean and direct, which he appreciated. I have one condition, he said. What's that? Sophie has a thing every Wednesday at 4. A drawing class she's been doing since 2nd grade. I pick her up. Every Wednesday. That's not a condition, Diana said. That's just your schedule. It's already in the flexibility structure. He was quiet. Jake, she said. Yeah. You're allowed to be a father and have a career. Those aren't competing things. He didn't say anything. The silence wasn't empty, though. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it. The weight of 4 years of choosing, every single day, between one thing and another, and the specific loneliness of a life built on making the right choice, and still sometimes, at 5 in the morning, wondering if you'd gotten it wrong. Okay, he said. We'll start the onboarding next month. I'll have Priya send the contracts today. Okay. And Jake? Yeah? For what it's worth, she said. And for a moment, the CEO cadence left her voice entirely, and it was just a woman on a phone, saying something she'd been carrying for a decade. I built this company in large part because I got to keep going. Because someone stopped. She paused. I don't say that to make it weird, I want you to know that it's not lost on me, where this is all coming from. He was in the parking lot behind Brennan's. The October sky was doing its gray thing again. He looked at it. Thank you, he said. See you next month, she said. 3 weeks later, a Saturday, mid-November, the first real snow of the year sitting on the ground in thin, determined patches, a car transporter arrived at 1714 Larimer Street at 9 in the morning. On it was Jake's truck. It had been detailed, mechanically overhauled, the windshield replaced with glass that was borderline invisible, the rust treated and sealed, the bumper, the famous bumper, repaired and repainted to an exact match of the original dark blue, the broken door seals, replaced, the worn upholstery, restored, not replaced, the same fabric, the same pattern, just returned to what it had been. It looked, in the November light, like it had looked in 2009. New. Or as close to new as a thing can look while still being itself. There was an envelope taped to the driver's side mirror. Jake stood in the cold in his socks. He'd come outside without shoes, and looked at the truck for a long time before he opened the envelope. Inside was a card. White cardstock. 4 words in Diana Mercer's handwriting, which was small and slightly left-leaning. Heroes rarely look rich. Sophie came outside 5 minutes later, in her yellow raincoat, because of course she did. She stood next to her father and looked at the truck. It looks the same, she said. Yeah, but different. Yeah, both, she decided, and leaned against his arm. He put his arm around her. The snow was doing its thing, not falling exactly, more drifting. The first snow always more like a suggestion. Dad, she said. Yeah. The new car is still blueberry, right? We're not trading it for the truck? He looked at her. No, he said. We're keeping both. Good. She looked at the truck. Because the truck is Grandpa and Mom and all that stuff, and the new one is, you know, all the new stuff. She shrugged inside her raincoat. We need both. He looked at his daughter. 8 years old, almost 9, standing in the snow in the yellow raincoat with her hands in her pockets, explaining to him, calmly and without any apparent awareness that it was a remarkable thing to say, the exact nature of continuity and change. He pulled her closer. She let him. The snow kept doing what it was doing. Epilogue. Brad Hollis was placed on administrative leave pending the results of the staff conduct review. 3 weeks later, following the completion of the review and a second complaint from another client, one from 8 months prior that had never been formally logged, he resigned. The entire Mercer flagship sales staff completed 12 hours of customer service and unconscious bias training before the showroom reopened. Tyler, to his credit, completed the training and then requested a transfer to a smaller lot where, by all accounts, he became genuinely better at his job. Jake Coleman started at Mercer Holdings on the first Monday of December. He brought Sophie to his new office on the first day, at her request, to check that it was okay. She walked around it twice, looked out the window at the parking lot below, and gave it a rating of, "Good, could use a plant." He bought a plant the following week. On the day he brought the plant in, he put it on the windowsill and stood for a moment, looking at the parking lot. His office was on the 3rd floor. From here he could see, in the far corner, his truck, the old restored truck, which he drove to work on Tuesdays and Thursdays because the highway miles were good for it. Sitting next to the Meridian, blueberry blue, that Sophie refused to call anything other than "our good car." He stood at the window for a moment with his coffee. He thought about Claire. He thought about the accident on Highway 9 and the woman whose name he hadn't known, and the specific cold of that January morning, and the feeling of making it back to the hospital in time. Claire's face when he walked in, and the way she'd held his hand, the one with the torn jacket sleeve, and said, "You always do things without telling me." He thought, "I'm still doing things without telling you." He thought, "I think you know, though." He turned from the window, sat at his desk, opened his laptop. The first morning of December, light on the parking lot, 2 cars in the far corner that belonged to him, a plant on the windowsill that smelled faintly of soil and greenness. He started working. If this story moved you, drop a comment below. Tell me which part got you. Was it Sophie in the blueberry color, the card at the end, or something quieter? Stories like this exist because of the people who watch, share, and come back. If you want to see more, subscribe and turn on notifications. It genuinely makes a difference. Every story we tell here is about the quiet, human moments that remind us what actually matters. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. This story follows Marcus Webb, a brilliant black toxicologist whose life was destroyed after he tried to expose dangerous research misconduct at a pharmaceutical institute. Once respected as Dr. Marcus Webb, he lost everything: his career, reputation, home, and marriage, after powerful people discredited his findings. Years later, he works quietly as a hospital janitor while raising his 7-year-old daughter, Maya, in a small but carefully organized apartment. Though the world now sees him as invisible, Marcus never stopped being a scientist. At the same hospital, 9-year-old Chloe Sterling, daughter of powerful CEO Eleanor Sterling, lies unconscious with a mysterious illness no doctor can explain. 18 specialists have failed to find a diagnosis. Eleanor, a woman used to controlling every outcome through power and money, watches helplessly as her daughter fades away. While cleaning the hospital at night, Marcus notices something strange outside Chloe's room: the faint chemical scent of DMSO, a compound he recognizes instantly from his toxicology background. His instincts tell him something is terribly wrong. Quietly, he begins observing patterns, documenting dates, tracking medical staff rotations, and recording chemical traces in a notebook. The evidence points toward a horrifying possibility. Someone is poisoning Chloe. The more Marcus investigates, the more suspicion centers around Dr. Thorne, Chloe's trusted physician. Thorne appears compassionate, ethical, and devoted, exactly the kind of man no one would question. But Marcus discovers a disturbing connection between Thorne's hospital shifts and Chloe's worsening condition. Behind the scenes, Thorne is secretly involved in a financial conspiracy tied to Sterling Corp's stock manipulation, where Chloe's death would trigger massive profits through a carefully timed short sale. Marcus desperately tries to warn Eleanor, but his past and appearance work against him. His PTSD causes his explanation to come out fragmented, and Eleanor sees only an unstable janitor approaching her daughter's room. Security removes him, and he is fired from the hospital for suspicious behavior. Most people would stop there. Marcus does not. Working from a makeshift laboratory beneath his apartment, he uses his remaining scientific skills to create a diagnostic reagent capable of exposing the toxin. Knowing time is running out, he risks everything by returning to the hospital one final night. Inside Chloe's room, Marcus interrupts Thorne just as the doctor prepares another injection. Security tackles Marcus, and once again he looks like the villain. But before being restrained, he asks Eleanor to take a blue vial from his jacket and test the liquid Thorne dropped. She hesitates, torn between the trusted doctor and the disgraced janitor. Then she remembers the look Marcus gave her days earlier, not threatening, but urgent. A look of someone trying to stop something terrible. She trusts him. The moment the reagent touches the liquid, it turns deep purple-black, undeniable proof of poisoning. The truth finally surfaces. Police discover financial records and evidence of a massive conspiracy involving Thorne and an investment group seeking profit from Eleanor's tragedy. Chloe survives. The toxin is identified, treatment begins, and her recovery slowly starts. But the greatest healing happens outside the ICU. Eleanor realizes how easily she judged Marcus based on fear, status, and appearances. Instead of offering money or empty apologies, she visits his apartment and begins again, not with power, but with honesty. The story closes with hope. Marcus is restored to the scientific world as director of toxicology at Sterling Corp's new research lab. Yet he keeps his old custodial badge beside his new ID card, a reminder of who he was, what he survived, and the price of being ignored. Nearby sits a photograph of Chloe and Maya laughing together, proof that compassion can bridge worlds adults often divide.